Hey, it's Dr. Asatar Bear, and this presentation is on the economic impact of government deficits and debt. So, as discussed previously, right, government deficits and surpluses are key tools of Keynesian fiscal policy, and they're used as part of fiscal management of the economy. Okay, so that is again the counter-cyclical pattern when aggregate demand is low, the government has to step in and spend more, stimulate investment, and so forth. And when aggregate demand is normal or high, then the government can cut expenses, do a bit less, and repay the debt that it accumulated. Okay, so you need deficits, you need to run deficits and surpluses basically in order to do any kind of Keynesian fiscal policy. Uh, but the question comes up, is any amount of debt okay? I mean, can there be too much debt? All right, so here's the United States history of the total public debt from 1940 to 2020. And remember, what we're talking about when we're talking about the total public debt is all of the bonds that are currently outstanding that the U.S. Treasury Department owes, right? These are liabilities, okay? So the asset holders, those who own these bonds, to them it's an asset, right? To the issuer, the U.S. government, the federal government, it's a liability. All right, so we can see here that the total public debt has increased massively in recent years. Right, it's growing far faster than other economic variables, things like economic growth, inflation, stuff like that. Right, if the debt was growing, but it was growing at the rate of inflation, that wouldn't be so bad, right? I mean, that's basically like staying the same, right? If it was growing even at the same rate as the economy was growing, again, not so bad, right? But what we see is it's growing far, far faster than that, all right? So, we just look at this period, we can kind of see. So from 2005, when the debt was about 10 trillion, to now, well, it's more than doubled, right? To 2005 is not all that long ago, 15 years ago. The current total public debt is 24.7 trillion as of April 2020. So we've seen a massive increase, 150% increase in just 15 years. That's much faster than the economy is growing, much faster than any other macroeconomic variable. That's troubling. Okay, so looking at the nominal value of the debt doesn't really tell us the whole story, right? We got to go deeper than that. We need to consider the debt relative to GDP. So when we do that, this is our pattern, again, looking at from this period from 1940 to 2020. So what we can see here is that it rose quite a bit from 1940 to 1945, and that's the impact of World War II, right? The gearing up, massive gearing up of spending to enter and fight World War II. After that, the debt to GDP ratio declined quite a bit, right? It went down to a low point in 1980, right? So going from about 110%, a little bit over that at its peak in 1945, to in 1980, declining to about 30%. That's a pretty remarkable effect right there. So what was happening? Let's check this out. Well, what was happening is a really massive post-war economic expansion. So that is, the rate of economic growth became very high, right? Very strong. The economy expanded substantially in the United States. It grew faster than the debt grew. So the debt never shrank, but the economy grew faster. So it shrank relative to the GDP. However, what happened this ended, right? We get into the 1970s. That's the end of the post-war boom, and growth slows, and so we get this kind of bottoming out, right? Now, what happens in the 1980s to make this then start to increase? Well, we have a Cold War arms race against the USSR, that's the Soviet Union, okay, now Russia. And this is very, very expensive, right? We fund this through massive deficit spending under Reagan and then Bush, and so it just sort of continues, okay? Um, However, then it does go down again, right? We can see right here reaches a peak, but then it starts to decline again. What's that about? Um, well, this is the deficit reduction that occurs under the Clinton administration. Okay, so deficit reduction had been before Clinton a very much a Republican concern, Republican issue, but the Clinton was able to triangulate this by taking that issue and making it his own. So reduce the deficit and even ran a small surplus by the end of his administration. So the debt to GDP ratio declined as a result, right? The GDP was growing, so the ratio, that changed the ratio. All right, then we move forward and we get, after the Clinton administration, we have the Bush administration, right? And that brings us wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. These are very expensive, right? It's all funded through deficit spending. Um, and that just really makes the debt start to shoot up much and grow much faster than the GDP. And of course, uh, once the Great Recession hits, um, we have the impact of that as well, right? The Obama years. Uh, and then after that, we have the Trump tax cuts, uh, which, continue on this upward trajectory. Okay? So the question that economists have is like, could we go back to something more like this period, right, where the debt to GDP ratio was falling? Because now, I mean, to have it be rising again, it's a troublesome type of thing, right? Debt, we all know this mathematically, it must be repaid at some point, right? Um, is it not going to be heavier and heavier, more and more difficult to repay as if the debt to GDP ratio continues to rise like this? And the answer is, yeah, of course it is, right? Um, so nobody knows what's going to happen next, but this is what we're going to explore in this presentation. Okay, so let's zoom in a little bit here, and let's just look at the growth of the debt since 1980. So again, we're after the post-war expansion. We're in a different era where economic growth has slowed. So 1980 is, of course, the beginning of the Reagan Revolution. Okay, so what I've got here is a table. It looks at by year what is the total public debt, and what is, this is nominal. Okay, it's not, so that means it's not adjusted for inflation. Uh, and because we're just looking at the growth of the debt, we need to consider inflation as well, but um, it's accurate to show the nominal value in this case. Okay, then we're looking at the rate of growth and also the nominal growth, right? How much was added to it during that time, during that year. Okay, so our story begins in 1980 when the total public debt stood at $908 billion. All right. Uh, so what happens next, and this is interesting, right? Because the president at the time, President Reagan, was brought in and he really promised to rein in the deficit. He really slammed the Democrats and Jimmy Carter for being free spending, tax and spend liberals, right? Um, I'm not going to do that. I'm gonna be fiscally conservative. This was the message of the Republicans for a long time. Uh, Interestingly, like the very first thing that happens here um, is that the expands by almost 10%, right, under Reagan's very first year. And he has to go to Congress and ask them to raise the debt ceiling. Now, the debt ceiling is a kind of like a fictional thing, right? But it's I say it's fictional because it doesn't really limit the debt. It's just like an act of Congress, and it says, the Treasury can't borrow any more than we've said it can borrow. And so anyway, the debt ceiling stood at $1 trillion back in the day, right? And Reagan had to go to Congress and say, well, we need you to lift it, but don't worry, it's just temporary. We'll soon have the deficits under control, and the debt will be a thing of the past. And don't worry, we'll never even touch the 1 trillion mark, but we just need you to raise it, temporarily, right? Um, and so, of course, the funny thing here is that, well, the debt continues to expand massively, right? Because like we saw on the previous graph, I mean, we're in the midst of this heating up Cold War with the Russians, and Reagan is very, very enthusiastic about that Cold War, right? Says we're going to do Star Wars. We're going to we're going to bankrupt you, basically, right? If you don't keep up with us, we're going to have a much better military equipment, and we're going to win, right? So the debt grows very substantially, very rapidly during this time. Um, right? So, look at this: about 10%, then almost 15%, 20% per year. That's very rapid growth of debt, right? Um, that's what I mean by much more rapid. At the time, economic growth at the time is much, much lower than that, right? In the neighborhood of about 3%. So this is growing at a much more rapid rate, okay? And look at this: within a few years, contrary to the promise, oh, don't worry, we'll never touch the $1 trillion mark. By 1986, look at this, we're at the over $2 trillion, right? Uh, what a reversal! I mean, this is fiscal responsibility. This is fiscal conservatism. Doesn't look like it, right? It's so massive growth in the deficits. By the time we get to the end of the Reagan administration here in 1988, uh, the deficit stands at $2,602 billion. That's $2.6 trillion. Uh, and it's grown by a massive 1.6 trillion from where it started, right? Uh, so really, really strong growth of debt. Okay. Now, if we continue this into the next president is Bush, right, who had been the vice president under Reagan. So this is in a lot of ways a continuation. We get into the late 80s and early 90s. This is the Bush senior years, right? And you can see that pattern more or less continued unabated during that time. And so by the time we get to the end of the Reagan Bush years, that 81 to 92, those years, what we find is the deficit started off right about $1 trillion and ended up at $4 trillion. Like, wow, that's a really big expansion, right, in a pretty short period of time. All right, so the Clinton years saw a decrease in deficits, but debt continued to grow, though more slowly. All right, so we're seeing here that there isn't really a pattern of following the textbook Keynesian ideas, right? Which is, yeah, you use debt as a tool during a recession, but then you run surpluses and pay it back during the expansion. What we're seeing here is structural deficits, right? That is, deficits are a way of life. They never get pulled back. There's never really any surpluses during this entire period. So, and we can say that for the last 40 years, there's no budget surpluses. Okay, so getting into the early 90s here, the Clinton years, we can see the debt is growing somewhat more slowly. Okay, so 8.5%, 6.4%, 6.0%, 5%, and so forth. It's growing a little bit more slowly, but it's actually still growing, right? However, we get to, by the end of the Clinton administration, we've gotten to a point right down here, right, where the debt is growing much more slowly, right? And so the nominal, this is the lowest amount that the debt has ever grown during this series, okay? So by $18 billion in the year 2000, that's the last year of the Clinton administration. So they were running a small surplus, but they were still rolling over the debt. That is, issuing more bonds in order to pay for the interest on previous bonds. The total public debt at the time stood at 5.6 trillion. Okay, so it's still, it had expanded during this time, but by a bit less than under the certainly less as a percentage, about the same amount, as under the Reagan years. Um, okay, so now we look at the Bush administration, and of course, what they did here, they increased debt massively in order to fund wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The vice president at the time, Dick Cheney, said that debt doesn't matter. And we certainly see that in terms of their actions. That is, there's never really an attempt to to rein in spending under that administration whatsoever. So, initially the debt grows rather slowly. This is kind of a holdover from the Clinton years. But in 2002, this is when the war in Afghanistan begins. So, and that causes spending to go up significantly, and that pattern continues all the way up until we get to what's happening in 2008 is the Great Recession is just hitting, and so we have a growth in spending that occurs during that time, right? So look at what's happening, right? We go from 5.8 trillion to 10 trillion by the end of the Bush years, right? Again, the rate of growth, though it starts off low, it really picks up as we go, right? At 11.3%. Again, that's much, much faster than the economy is not growing anywhere near that fast, right? And in fact, as 2008, at the end of 2008, we enter the Great Recession, and the economy's growth slows and becomes negative for a time. All right, so the Obama administration, right, they did large fiscal stimulus, they did healthcare reform, they never really trimmed some of the big ticket costs of the federal government. The biggest single one is military spending, right? So there's large increases in debt that continue. All right, so again, we look at our table. We look at 2009, we saw a rather large expansion of the debt, right? Almost 20% expansion. That's big, right? And these expansions continue throughout the Obama years. So, the economy continues to be weak for years after even though the Great Recession formally ends by 2011, the economy is still very weak. It's still very fragile. In 2013, Obama administration tries to pull back some of the spending, but they end up, and so what we see is the rate of the growth of the debt slows somewhat in the last few years of the Obama administration, going from 18.8% to down to 4.3% by the end there. But still, the debt increases quite a bit just under the Obama years, right? It goes from, just under 12 trillion to almost 19 trillion, right? A pretty big expansion of the debt during that time. And the Trump administration, of course, did large tax cuts, and they also had a massive stimulus around the COVID-19 pandemic. So, there's fewer years of the Trump administration here. So we can look at, 2017, 2018. We find the growth of the debt is low during those years. At this point, the economy, is in a growth mode. So, this is one of the things, reason why the rate of growth of the debt is lower. But we get into 2020, of course, and we find, again, we start seeing pretty big numbers in terms of percentage change of the debt, right? And the nominal growth of the debt in 2020, just in a portion of 2020, these numbers only go up to April 2020. So just in March and April alone, the debt increased by 1.5 trillion, right, and 2.7 trillion in just this portion of 2020. So the debt is really increasing much faster now as a result of that COVID-19 stimulus. So if we look at the big picture here, look at it on average, it seems to be the case that the federal budget seems to have a structural deficit, right? That is, it's not really so much about, are we in a recession or are we in an expansion? And that structural deficit seems to be about $1,000 billion a year. Okay, if we look at everything, right? If we just look at how much is the debt increasing, okay? I think this is the most accurate way to look at this particular part of total debt. We look at deficits, it often doesn't include the yield on the debt that must be paid, and is typically paid by rolling over the debt, that is issuing more bonds in order to pay the yield. Right, about $1,000 billion a year. that can only be closed through large changes in revenue and spending. Okay, so um, but the debt problem is actually much larger than this, much more significant. Let's just touch on the question: does intra-agency debt matter? Okay, so what this means is, right, the media, many economists, and government agencies commonly distinguish between the debt that is owed to the public, which means that's not including the debt which is held by government agencies. That is what's called intra-agency or intragovernmental debt. Okay, so the amount that's held by the public is $19.1 trillion dollars. The amount that's held by government agencies is 5.9 trillion dollars, right? And again, this is as of May 2020. Um, the debt can change quickly, so you have to update this, get the current figures. Uh, there is no real justification for separating debt into these different categories. Okay, all the debt matters. Uh, Debt held by the public is really a meaningless distinction. What matters is the total. Um, the total public debt must include all government debt, including that held by government agencies such as the Social Security Administration. You cannot say that just because the government or a portion of the government owns that debt, that we're just not going to count it. There's no economic justification for that. The agencies which own that debt consider it to be an asset, right? They are holding it on their balance sheet as an asset, just like everybody else. It doesn't matter that they are part of the government, right? The government can't say, oh, we owe that to ourselves. No, no, you can't say that, right? You actually have to repay it. It doesn't matter that it's an agency or whatever. So I think it's a very, very misleading when you take a fairly significant portion of the debt, almost $6 trillion, and just wave it away and act like it doesn't matter. It matters. All right, if we look at the ownership of the U.S. total public debt, that is, who owns it, into kind of broad categories. Okay, we already looked at one portion of it. Okay, this one right here, right, the interagency debt, about 6 trillion. We can see that there's a foreign share. Okay, so that is individuals, institutions, banks, etc., outside the United States own about $6.8 trillion of it. The Federal Reserve owns about 4 trillion of this debt. Um, Individuals, banks, businesses, other U.S. institutions own about $3.8 trillion of it. Um, Financial institutions such as mutual funds, right, own about $2.2 trillion. State and local governments own about a trillion, and pension funds own about 0.7 trillion. Okay, so it just gives you an idea of the kind of ownership of it, right? So it's individuals, it's institutions, it's banks, it's parts of the government, like the Federal Reserve. Um, okay, so now this section is what I call debt nonsense. It's reasons why the debt doesn't matter, and these are pretty commonly heard types of things. Okay, here's one thing people say: we owe it to ourselves, um, or another thing that people sometimes say uh, is that the U.S. had a high debt to GDP ratio after World War II, and it declined due to post-war growth. Something like that could happen again. We don't need to worry about it. Here's another thing: the Fed can write a check for the whole amount and pay it off at any time. And finally, the U.S. is a sovereign power, and the debt is in U.S. dollars. Um, so all of these statements are either untrue or just very misleading. So to say that we owe it to ourselves, um, that is just utter nonsense. I mean that um, that's a little bit like saying, uh, "Oh, a human owes another human money." Well, you're all humans. I mean, so forget about it. Well, look, the debt still has to be repaid. To say Americans owe Americans money doesn't say anything whatsoever, right? That's not useful. So that's not really an argument. That's a fiction. Um, All right, then the next one here, right? The U.S. had a high debt to GDP ratio. Um, I mean, yeah, that it's true that it declined, but I think it's very dangerous to assume that exact same thing will happen again, right? The U.S. accumulated debt after World War II for a very specific reason, for a very short period of time, and then it witnessed a tremendous economic expansion. Um, I personally do not believe that a huge economic expansion, multi-decade long economic expansion, is right around the corner. And even if it is, will it be large enough to decrease the debt to GDP ratio? I doubt it. I mean, the debt to GDP ratio is at a much higher level now. Um, and the fact is that as capitalist economies mature, it's more difficult to see rapid economic growth. I mean, rapid economic growth typically comes from industrializing. And you only get to industrialize once, right? Um, so unless there's some kind of huge technological innovation coming that we don't know about, which is possible, but that's a lot to pin your hopes on, right? Um, all right, what about the next one, right? The Fed can write a check for the whole amount and pay it off at any time. Well, this is one of these things that is technically true but very misleading, right? Um, yeah, they could pay it off. That's true. The Fed could write a check, and by doing so, they would create money out of thin air, and they would pay then whoever owns that debt. Um, the reason I say it's misleading is, and we're going to get to this later in the course when we talk about monetary policy, uh, is that this would cause substantial inflation. You would increase the total money supply in the United States massively by doing this, um, and that causes inflation. And inflation basically hurts the bondholders. You you are paying off debt, but you're weakening the value of the currency. So yes, okay, they technically pay it off, but only by really screwing over those who own the bonds, right? And that's what the last point is saying too, right? The U.S. is a sovereign power. The debt is in U.S. dollars. That's basically like saying we can repudiate the debt anytime we want. We don't really have to pay it. We could just be like, well, here's some dollars, right? That's something we completely control. Um, that is a recipe for never having people loan to you again. Um, if you screw over the bondholders, if you inflate away the debt, um, that is a very, very negative thing, right? That's like I said, you don't get a continuation of borrowing. What you get is people are not going to be willing to buy your bonds in the future, and then you have to immediately stop you running deficits. Um, so this is why we look at the situation and it's unsustainable. Okay, um, it will have to change, and how will it change? Nobody knows, right? I don't know. Um, I'm just pointing out, right, that it's a highly unsustainable situation. Okay, so there are other sources of debt in the U.S. economy as well. Um, the federal budget deficit is not the only source of debt. State and local governments are also highly indebted. States also issue their own bonds. Local governments issue their own bonds. There's municipal bonds, for example. Um, so there's debt is a big problem at every single level of government. There's also a long-standing U.S. trade deficit. Um, and the federal government is basically dramatically underfunded relative to its mandatory liabilities. And what this means is, based on the current laws of the United States, okay, there's certain spending which is called mandatory spending, right? That is, we've made commitments, and that makes that we need to set aside money in order to fund those commitments. Now, the law could be changed at any time, right? But this is relative to the laws that we have on the books right now, right? So to get a better understanding of debt and liabilities, we need to define the concept which is called net present value. Okay, net present value, and what that is, it's the current value of future income or assets. Okay, so for example, all right, let's say that you have the choice between getting $1,000 now or $1,000 in 5 years. Now, obviously, you would much rather have $1,000 now, right? Like, you always want the money now. You don't need to take economics class to know that. Get the money now. Uh, so, but here's a question, right? If you had to try to like make an equivalency and say, okay, listen, you're going to either get $1,000 in 5 years or X dollars today, right? Well, what is the amount that makes it equivalent, right? What's the amount that you would accept or that everyone in general would kind of accept, right? Um, so this is called the present value of the $1,000, right? $1,000 5 years in the future has a present value that is right now. What is it? What is that worth? Okay, and we get to it by using something called the discount rate. Okay, the discount rate takes into account the fact that, well, see, there's all these other factors, right? There's an interest rate. Okay, so if you had $1,000 now and you loaned it to somebody, you'd be getting more, right? Um, if you had a smaller amount of money and you could loan it to somebody for 5 years, then they have to pay you back more, right? So it would be closer to $1,000 because of interest, right? So we have to take that into account, right? The interest rate, or more generally speaking, we could call it the real rate of return, okay? So we also have to take account of the fact that there's risk. Hey, you might not be around in 5 years, or nope, anything could happen, right? We have to add something to this rate for that. And of course, we have to add something for inflation, okay? So the discount rate has to include all of these different things that we expect to happen moving forward. All right, so here's the calculation, okay? The present value is equal to the future asset value divided by 1 plus d raised to the t power, okay? So where d is the discount rate, okay, like we've defined it, all right? The official U.S. government discount rate is 4.7%. That is 0.047, okay? Uh, little t stands for the number of years in the future. Um, so how many years in the future are we talking about? Okay, so let's do a little example. All right, let's say the present value of $1,000 in 5 years at a discount rate of 5%, just to keep it a little bit simpler. So we're plugging this in. We're going to put 1,000 on top, and then we're going to divide that by 1 plus d. Okay, so d in this case is 0.05. All right, so 1 plus 0.05, that's 1.05 on the inside of those parentheses. And then we are going to raise that to the fifth power, okay, because it's in 5 years. All right, so 1,000 on top, 1.05 to the fifth power on the bottom. And when we do that, we get $783.53, okay? So $783.53 is the present value of $1,000 in 5 years, okay, at a discount rate of 5%. So very important for us to get a grips on future assets, and maybe you can see why this is relevant to the government, right? Because the government has income coming in the future, right? Like the government gets income this year from taxes, but it's also going to have income next year. It's also going to have spending next year, okay? So we have to take that into account, not just this year, but what's happening in the future. All right, so and the word net here, just I've been using this phrase, net present value. That just means we are netting out any deductions from that income. Okay, so now let's look at this, and instead of saying it's just a one-time payment of $1,000 in 5 years, let's say that we're talking about an income stream, okay, that flows into the infinite future. All right, and this is called the infinite time horizon. And this measures the value today of a stream of income that flows into the indefinite future, okay? So into the future forever, right? In perpetuity, all right? So let's say, for example, $1,000 a year in perpetuity, so forever, okay? What's that worth right now, right? So again, to do this, we're going to do a pretty simple formula, okay? We're going to say, what is the value of that income stream? And we are going to divide by the discount rate, little d, okay? So in our example, the income stream is $1,000, we're just going to simply divide that by 0.05 and we're going to get $20,000. Okay? So this gives us a kind of, you might see the usefulness of this, right? Like, what if you are buying and selling something that is an income stream, right? Maybe it's something like a business. So here we have a business that generates $1,000 a year. We expect it'll be around forever, right? What is that worth today? Maybe you want to buy that business. It's a lemonade stand, right? It generates $1,000 a year in income. I want to buy your lemonade stand. I'll give you $20,000 for it, right? That's what I've calculated to be the net present value, right? That's what I have to. That's what I'd be willing to pay in order to gain access to that income into the future. Okay, net present value over the infinite time horizon. So government revenues and expenditures can only really be properly understood by using this net present value infinite time horizon. But that's not really how government spending is reported, right? What makes sense mathematically, what has an economic meaning, if you listen to economists, right, this is what we say, hey, report your figures in a way that everyone reports it, right, in the standard way, which is, again, mathematically standard. The government doesn't do things like that at all right? So, and let's see what the consequences of that are. Let's explore that. So, government spending is reported in ways that are very highly sensitive to arbitrary language choices and to the time period. Okay, so for example, Social Security obligations are not considered debt, right? Even though they are mandatory future spending, that means we have to spend money in the future, just as if we borrowed money, we would have to repay it plus interest, right? So it's not considered debt, but it is considered a funding liability, right? Or a spending liability, like a future liability. Okay. Now, that's just language, right? Whether we call something debt or whether we call it a liability or future spending or whatever, right? Those are just words. There's no mathematical difference between that, right? To say, well, if we say debt or if we say unfunded liability or whatever, it doesn't really matter, It's the same amount of money in the end, okay? So again, this is how economists think. We don't, we want something that doesn't really matter what you call it so that you can't confuse somebody. You can't lie, basically, lie on paper by calling it something else, by changing the name. That doesn't work in mathematics because, a number is a number, right? It's almost like the government wants figures that are intentionally difficult to understand, right? Now, let me give you an example, okay? Okay, so the point here is that debt can be hidden by the choice of the time period, all right? So the Social Security Administration calculates its unfunded obligations, as it calls it, in two ways, okay? So you can look at the infinite time horizon, or you can look at it through 2094, and you would think that wouldn't make much of a difference, right? We're going pretty far into the future, 2094. Wow, I mean, that's 74 years from now, right? So the unfunded obligation, if we go through 2094, is 16.8 trillion. And I know that sounds like a lot of money, right? Wow, 16.8 trillion. Okay, that would actually, should we not be adding that to the debt? Yeah, but actually that's not the full extent of the problem, right? Because if we go through the infinite horizon, right, again, that is the most mathematically accurate way of doing this, because then we don't stop. Like, why stop at 2094? Why not stop at 2070? Or why not? That's arbitrary, right? And your choice of where you stop is going to end up affecting your number, right? Because if you go into the indefinite future, the infinite horizon, what you get is $53 trillion. That's a pretty big difference, right? I mean, that's 3 times higher. So you want to stop in 2094, again, arbitrary, but if you do that, you're making it your unfunded liability, your unfunded obligation look a lot smaller, right? That's very misleading. There should not be a way to make your unfunded obligation look smaller, right? That shouldn't exist, okay? And the way that the Social Security Administration does this is, okay, so this is a little section of the Social Security trustees report. Okay, I have that linked at the bottom there where you find that. This is at ssa.gov. This is page 204 of a very lengthy document, right? This is buried in the footnotes, right? About what are the unfunded obligations and the different ways of calculating it and whatever, right? So, for convenience, I'm just showing this, so I'm circling this, right? Here's the present value. Um, and this is like hiding debt off the books, right? This is the government's way of hiding debt and not really putting it on the books. Um, it's it's 53. What is this number? 53.0. That's $53 trillion in off the books debt. And again, it's on page 204. Um, that is as close to the government gets to lying about numbers, right? Um, Government lies about all kinds of things actually, but they the statistics that they track and whatever report, they tell the truth about, but they sometimes will bury the truth far away, right? Um, like in this manner. Now, when you do this for all of the federal liabilities in the future, right? That is, you use the infinite time horizon, you get a pretty staggering figure. Okay, it's $210 trillion, right? That is the total extent, the net present value, the extent of the government unfunded liabilities into the future. $210 trillion. That's actually far, far greater than the total public debt, right? I mean, what's commonly reported in the media is this figure right here, right? 19.6 trillion. The debt held by the public, right? Um, Versus 210 trillion. Well, you get a very different picture of what is the problem here, right? 19.6 trillion actually sounds kind of high. 210 trillion sounds a lot higher, right? It is a lot higher. Um, so, what do we make of this, right? What do we do with this information? Well, economists look at this and say, well, the government should not do this, right? They shouldn't lie in a fancy way, right? They should be transparent. They should use generally accepted accounting principles, and they should use net present value with infinite time horizon. Over 1,500 economists, including 19 of the Nobel Prize winners, have signed on to a statement which calls for the government to do that. This is called the Inform Act, and you can see their signatures at theinformact.org. Okay, so what are the possible effects on the economy of this? Um, Reinhardt and Rogoff, back in 2010, wrote a very influential paper, and they found that when the debt to GDP ratio got higher than a certain level, about 90%, that a country begins to grow more slowly. Now, this has been a very controversial result in economics, um, and Reinhardt and Rogoff used that to make the case for austerity, for cutting spending, um, and so much very controversial. A lot of economists said, there's issues with your numbers. Herndon, Ash, and Pollan, for example, challenged some of their findings and looked disaggregated the numbers and said, that's not actually true. So a big question in economic theory: do countries grow more slowly as they take on more debt? Um, we don't know the answer to that exactly, but debt always has to be repaid, right? So what we know is as the debt to GDP ratio gets high, it becomes increasingly unlikely that a country will actually repay its debts, and it's going to do one of three things, right? One of three things has got to happen. Um, so these are the possible outcomes. Okay, the one is that the rate of economic growth exceeds the rate of growth of debt. That would be a happy outcome, right? That's like the post World War II result. Um, so that'd be great, right? That will lower the debt to GDP ratio. Might not lower the absolute amount of the debt, but this is a kind of optimistic scenario. All right. Okay, the second thing is we could have debt repudiation or restructuring. What that means is a government says we're just not going to pay it, right? Or they might say, yeah, we're going to pay it, but we need to restructure because we cannot bear the burden of this. Um, Now, this has happened a lot in the developing world. In the 1970s, the developing world, much of the developing world, went into a kind of debt crisis where debt repudiation and restructuring became common among developing countries. But it's rare otherwise, rare in the industrialized nations, and it's never happened in the United States. Um, so, that's it. That's a real question mark. Um, you could also have a third option. I think this is probably the most likely, right? This is decreasing the real value of the debt through just simply inflating the currency. So that is, you pay back the bondholders, but you pay them back through depreciated, lower value money because you've created a massive amount of money, right? Like, in order to pay back 25 trillion in debt, you would have to massively increase the money supply. You'd have to more than double the money supply, right? How do you think that's going to affect the value of the dollar? Well, it's probably going to lower the value of the dollar, right? I mean, it's not going to raise it, probably, right? Um, it's probably going to lower it. So everyone who buys U.S. bonds thinking, "Oh, this is great. I'll hold this bond for this and this period of time, and I'll get a 20% return." Well, all right. So you get a 20% return. That means you go from $100 to $120. But guess what? Your $120 now buys only $60 worth of stuff. So on paper, the country has kept its promise to you. We paid you $120, but in real terms, you just been screwed over, right? I mean, you started with 100 and now you have 60 in real value, right? Um, so that's repudiating the debt in a sneaky fashion, right? That's not saying, well, hey, we can't pay it. It's paying it, but not really. Okay. Um, Again, I think that's the most likely outcome here. Um, but nobody knows, right? This is an area of debate in economic theory. All this presentation is designed to do is just point out that we're on an extremely unsustainable path, and that there's a lot of deception, a lot of misleading stuff around it, a lot of reasoning that is just not at all mathematically sound, not economically sound. So, the I hope the point of taking economics class, right, is so that you develop clearer thinking on this, right, and whatever you end up thinking about it or whatever you think is going to happen, it's at least informed by the best reasoning that you can use. All right, that's my presentation. Thank you very much.